Thank you, Laurie. And on that cheerful note, we're going to welcome Peter Buckingham to come and address us. So Peter has also over 30 years of experience in the film industry, starting at the brave age of 8, in both the private and public sectors, covering production, distribution and exhibition. He's worked on some really high-profile projects, including the creation of the world's first digital screen network in the UK and the pioneering Find Any Film website. His focus is on maximising reach to and engagement with audiences and consumers. And this man does not rest on his laurels. He's been here less than 48 hours, already had a swim, a run, been to a pub and watched a game. What else was it, Peter? Anyway, welcome to your... Yeah. So, welcome, Peter. We're ready, if you are.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to slightly move this on from the piracy thing, which is I'll refer back to a bit later on, and into the value side of the questions, really. I suppose best described as really how one can best expect now and perhaps in the future to get value out of the cinema value chain or system. The first thing is to say, really, is that which I'll speak to a bit more about in a minute, but the system is under pressure, and that the value chain is under pressure itself. And perhaps the good or the bad thing is that you're not alone in these pressures. These are pressures facing independent producers, distributors, and anyone in platforms across the whole value chain across Europe and in America. And in many cases, especially in Europe, the national agencies are seeking to look at this value chain and perhaps encourage some disruption in it, mainly over the issue about windows. For the European-wide agency, they are also trying to have a look at and experimenting around windows. But they're also experimenting with something else, which is seen with complete horror by the established film industry and indeed the national agencies, and that is that they're looking to create a single market, a single digital market for any film available in digital. In other words, what that means is that territorialization would no longer be allowed in Europe for digital online film distribution. If it's available in Poland at any one time, it is available everywhere across Europe, which has or may have profound implications for the whole independent film financing sector. Now, that last one is being firmly resisted. I bring this up to sort of demonstrate really the kind of solutions that are floating around by people trying to solve this problem. Now, I'm going to come at it from a slightly different perspective, which is really around, I hope, a perspective of audience or consumer, a word not often used in polite society. So the first one is this, which is, I go back in history. I did start my film career in 1978 as a projectionist, 35mm projectionist. It's a shame that's gone. That's the only skill I've ever had. I don't have any other skills apart from talking, which is a real shame, except, anyway. In those days, supply of films was heavily restricted. For those who've got long enough memories, it was a very limited distribution and exhibition world. Also, there was no digital television, and television, therefore, had also a highly restricted access to films, and consumers or audiences had very little opportunity to see, especially independent films. And we were, rightly, those of us in the independent sector, which I've been in nearly all my life, those of us, we were rightly very angry about this, very annoyed, and essentially believed that if it wasn't for these gatekeepers, whether these were cinema owners, whether the TV programmers, and so on, that actually the films that we were making, working with, and so on, would be free to be seen and would be seen by the great British or wider public. And when the world went on, as things went on, around about 1979, 1980, we have, it's quite weird, we're not quite sure when, we have the first VHS cassette and the beginning of home entertainment. And the home entertainment thing began, in a sense, to liberalise what became available to people in the home. But we still, as we moved into the 80s, 1980s and beyond, still believed that this was dominated by gatekeepers, which indeed it was. Retail stores decided how many copies were going to be bought, which is the way that you got your revenue, and indeed how they were promoted in stores and so on and so forth. Anyway, time goes on and we have the rise of the independent film sector. We're still complaining, by the way. And we're rising on the tide of home entertainment revenue. And then we reach the 1990s, and in 1997 you get the first DVD, which was actually of Twister, the film. And that came out in 97, and we have a whole new rush of technological change, and change that consumers and audiences really liked because they get a better experience in the home. And we have a flood of new money, both from back catalogue and also obviously from new films that are coming out. We had a higher price for the DVDs and so on. And by 2004, as it happens, you reached, although we didn't know it at the time, probably reached the peak of home entertainment value across all the developed film economies. We didn't know it at the time, and we're still complaining. And it's around that time in 2004-05 that obviously you get the advent of digital and the advent of the kind of like the concept of the long tail. Chris Anderson's book comes out like 2006-07, I think. And before that, you've got the kind of the beginning of a glimmer of hope where you have a world with no shelf space issues. So no shelf space issues means no gatekeepers in my book. So therefore, there's a whole kind of surge of optimism, and I am as guilty as absolutely anyone. By now, I'm working at the Film Council, and my job is to try and develop audience tastes and increase the range and breadth of cinema going and watching and film watching in the UK. And I get very excited around this in the mid-2000s, and I become fairly evangelical and start talking about the long tail and other aspects of this, and how, in effect, we're going to be liberated from the ghastly gatekeepers, the heathens who at that point were controlling all the channels of which all these great movies were being restricted from. And then as it went on about 2010-11, I began to slightly wonder how true this was. And in this slight disillusionment, either I was getting too old and should leave, or indeed there was something not quite right that was going on in terms of what I hoped would be a revolution in terms of cinema, film take-up. And it turns out really that what we've moved from is into a world of abundance. And more films are being made than ever been made before, and they're more available everywhere, all over the place, all at the same time. And this world of abundance has not actually meant that any more films are necessarily seen, or at least any more revenue is coming into the system than it was before. And in fact, for anyone looking at the graphs, that we're seeing a marked decline in the amount of money going into home entertainment. That's because of the decline of the DVD price, and VOD pricing and also take-up has not matched it. So what we're actually seeing is a world where everything is available at all times, it is actually losing its concept of value. So in other words, which kind of makes sense. I'm not an economist, but it kind of makes sense. The more things are available, the cheaper they're likely to be perceived. And in a sense, this is where the music industry could actually show us an example. More music is available everywhere, and it's almost valueless. So that's the kind of like the kind of turnaround, in a sense, of what I'm sort of now thinking about, and that actually a solution or solutions to the problem we have about value that lie in the sense of having made things more abundantly available than ever may not actually be in the medium or long term benefit of what we're trying to solve, which is actually a value system that maintains itself. And I'll say something on a personal level on this. You know, it's true that all of us in my particular age group have moaned our way through the digital revolution and DVDs, etc. But we've actually had a very good career. Some of us made some quite considerable amounts of money in the independent sector, and some of us have done pretty well. I doubt whether that's the same these days. I think people are struggling on their sense to do that, and that people coming into this business, I've got a daughter who's 27, and I told her not to enter the film business because I was concerned about the forthcoming aspects of where the business is going and the way that it is actually trying to get some money out of it. So the urgency that I think we feel is that what we have to do is to try and understand a bit better how we're going to maintain or increase the value rather than actually cut prices, for example, as a solution to the problem that we have, or indeed maybe to make things more available than ever. So that's my first kind of observation or point about this. And the second point is this, really, which is, well, where is the value? Or where might value actually lie and where it is? Now, and this weirdly goes back into the world of cinema. Because cinema is, although it's showing some forms a slight decline in emissions, has actually, on a value basis, been the one area that's actually increased or increasing its the amount over the years. So much so that cinema is becoming more and more, and will become more and more important as a part of the transactional value chain. In other words, I think from Screen Digest, or IHS as it's now called, I think by 2018 or 2017, about 65% of all transactional value. All transactional value, by that I mean obviously VOD and DVDs and so on, as well as cinema tickets, will come from cinema. That is a worldwide figure. So in other words, what we're seeing is a kind of not exactly reversion back to the 1970s, before home entertainment comes, but an area or a world whereby we used to go into the cinema as the way of getting value into DVD, and it was a lost leader, is now becoming less and less true. And actually, that cinema is the place where value is actually going to be sustained or maintained. And that's a really important point. Because it is therefore that however unwilling we may want to be on this, and however much we might love to have a magic bullet that VOD will gallop to the rescue in value or in value terms, unfortunately it does seem to be, unfortunately, depending where your perspective you're coming from, unfortunately it means that the highly contested space of cinema might still be as more important or even more important in years to come than it's actually been over the past 10 years or so. And the other thing about the cinema is, and this refers back a bit into some of the stuff that Laurie just mentioned here and so on, is this, which is that in general terms, and I don't quite know how true it is here, but let's put this out as a kind of proposition really, which is a challenge for us, which is one of the challenges is an age generation gap between where cinema and film fit, and between younger people and older people. For older people like me, or maybe slightly younger, cinema was seen as the gold standard. This is the place and space where you went to see a film, and anything else was a compromise. In effect, TV was a compromise, DVD was an acceptable compromise. Certainly, watching a film on a laptop or a smartphone is a step too far. It's just like it is too far away from what we consider to be the gold standard of the big screen experience, whether it's big sound or big screen and so on. For younger people, and there was this research that we did in the UK ourselves, but I think it kind of strikes true, and I'd be interested to know what you think about this. For younger people, it's slightly more different. They're more agnostic about what cinema is about. They're a little more concerned really about the value of stuff. So therefore what they're seeing is they're evaluating all the time what is the most cheapest or most valuable space or place that I might want to go and see this film. So in other words, if you're trying to put something up in front of a cinema ticket, which is say $10 or $15, whatever it is here, in there versus a VOD thing for young people, they will almost certainly, unless they have very special reasons to go to the cinema, will almost certainly gravitate towards the cheaper option, which is in the home. Because they're not seeing it at the moment as a prime space to be able to go, that is the best space to see a film. Now, in my opinion, our job somewhere along the line is to try and maintain value, not to decrease value. So I would be saying that what I'm trying to do here is one of two things. Either to try and convince young people that actually cinema is the best place to see a film and it is the gold standard, and or to make sure that the films that I'm making that appeal to young people are actually of a sufficient filmic or cinematic value that they believe that they have to go and see this in the cinema as opposed to seeing it in the home, even if it's on piracy or on a hypothetical day-and-date release. And the last thing about this little particular section about the value chain is about pricing. Pricing is an extraordinarily difficult issue, and obviously it's problematic in all sorts of ways and so on. And on one sense, I was stunned by the low numbers that were just given about the pricing and there about premium pricing and day-and-date pricing. If it was Price Waterhouse, wasn't it? Or I can't remember if it was Nielsen, whatever they did the research, Nielsen. If that's true, that pricing is that low for a premium VOD day-and-date pricing, then that is a serious problem if one is trying to extract more value out of the chain. It's not the case, I would say, in other areas, that there is seen to be a sort of value for a premium VOD window, which is maybe sort of around the price of a cinema ticket, sort of around there, if you are sort of. Okay, that's clearly not the case that's being here. Now, if that holds true, and that was the case, then there's no real advantage in a monetary factor apart from the piracy issues, of going on a day-and-date release. There's no premium value or to be taken from that. And that's a very, very important point to bear in mind. What is the premium value that you might want to get from a day-and-date VOD release as opposed to a normal one, which is a few weeks later? So is there a kind of solution, which is on the sort of third section on this, really, to all this kind of stuff and so on? And the answer is that probably not. This is a very difficult, very, very difficult area to talk about and to be in, etc. I think that one of the most important thing about a solution, and the experience I've had whenever one's come in to talk about, for example, the Windows discussions, or things like that, or even pricing, etc. One of the most important thing about that is to basically try and understand everyone else's position in the room, and not actually to try and propose solutions that are quite antagonistic towards each other, because that way doesn't really lie a solution. And I also think that a one size, having said all that, I think that a one size fits all, which has been mentioned before, one size fits all solution is not always appropriate and can be extraordinarily frustrating from a content owner, or from a film distributor or a producer's position when you encounter the fixed term Windows position. And I think that the way you might summarize where that gets its most frustrating point, and this is perhaps the position to start a discussion about, is the film. Independent films often share certain characteristics, and you could say that one of their core characteristics of an independent film is, which is probably why it's independent, is that it's probably not got the most appealing or most immediately appealing subject matter, but at its best is made a film that's got great word of mouth. So now you have something that's difficult to get people in, but if you get them in, they'll love it and tell other people. That's the worst kind of film for the exhibitor to deal with, because the holdovers don't work like that. They just don't. So factors, for example, like exit polls or what people feel about a film are utterly irrelevant when it comes to your holdover days. Right? I've begged and pleaded at times for those to be taken into account, because your midweeks and your next weekends, they're not going to dip your average 40%, you might dip 20%, but they're not. So what happens is, the worst thing that can happen, you've got a film playing its socks off, and it disappears out the cinemas after 2 weeks, and you have to wait your 4 months or whatever it is before it comes on to consumers coming back into play. And a good example of that was actually a day-and-date VOD a study, not exactly similar to what I was just talking about. It was called A Late Quartet, and you'll see the study on our on samplemedia.com. We did a whole report for the BFI's new models on this. But basically, A Late Quartet was older and played really well. I mean, incredibly well. It played unbelievably well. It was like 95 or 93%, one of the highest exit polls I think I can recall seeing. And it was to an older demographic. So in other words, people who don't normally come out in the first weekend and that kind of stuff and rely on word of mouth to do stuff and so on. Unfortunately, Curzon decided to go day and date with that film, and therefore it only played in a few cinemas. And conservatively, probably because of that, they ran out of cinemas to play in, and actually they probably left about £1 million box office on the table, partly due to the boycott. But also what that demonstrates is the damage that can be done to a film if it is truncated too early in its word of mouth life. Now there may be something around that to be dealt with in the kind of sensitivity around these issues of Windows, and actually looking at it entirely from a consumer position. Are we doing our audiences the best service by taking these films off when we do, when other data is telling us that actually this could run a bit more? So there may be some view, some way into that position. Now, finally, I mean, this is almost like a throwaway, and then I guess onto the panel or whatever. But on this, I feel slightly compelled to say this in a way, and I'll probably say this tomorrow. I will say this tomorrow in the workshops. Although there's something really, really underlying important in this whole of this room, and that is the importance of local films or Australian films. And they're important industrially, or I believe they're going to become very important industrially for a much wider industry and perhaps might be thinking about it at the moment. And the reason why I say that is this. It's the rise of the power of China. Or the power of China as a Chinese box office, a cinema box office. In 2004, China had practically no box office at all. In 2017, it'll have more box office than North America. Right? That is a seismic shift in Hollywood's attention. So Hollywood's attention will move. I mean, it's so drastic, so huge. It will move, or maybe is already even moving, or at least we're worried it may move, if you happen to be an exhibitor and not in China, away from our audiences, which is the ones we've been catered for the last 100 years, because that's where roughly the market was, sort of more or less, to a different type of audience who may not conform to the audiences that we have been relying upon for our 85 or 80% or even 98% of our revenue over the last 50, 80, 100 years. So in other words, if that is the case, and I get slightly anxious about this, well, who do I turn to and where do I turn? Well, one is alternative content. Right, so I'll do my best about that as an exhibitor. The other one is local films. Right? Where are my Australian films that fill the gap? Where are they going to come from? Because in most countries, the difference between a good year and a great year is a breakout hit, a local hit. You can see that in country after country after country. The system will bump along, giving it whatever percentage it is. Then the thing that will make a massive difference is one or two really big local films, the ones that come out from outside of the Hollywood process. So in effect, I think that what you may be looking at, or may begin a dialogue about, is to actually start to say to people, that to exhibitors especially, that your content supply, but you need to be perhaps a little more proactive in looking at your content with us to see whether your fears can be assuaged by helping Australian films come into the box office. And I believe as well that the final thing about this is that I literally, as I was coming here, I was screening Australia, and there was a little box, with a business newspaper. On the front of this newspaper, right in the front, it talked about craft beers. It talked about, okay, blimey, Australia craft. I noticed that yesterday, Australia craft. It's my first time here in Australia, by the way. That's why I'm a bit overawed. So I look at, you're into craft beers. This is excellent. Blimey, that travelled quick. We've only had them 4 years. Well, maybe it came from you. Oh, blimey. But anyway, this is the way it goes. But then there was a piece about the hops. It's actually the hops that go into craft beers. And there's some massive turnaround. For you used to get all the hops from Eastern European, because presumably it was cheap, no one gave a damn. And now, they're all coming from Victoria, and it's a massive change of the hops. They're all coming from local Australian. And I suddenly thought that really what we're looking at or seeing there is a kind of like a localization in a global digital world. That actually the kind of consumer trends and movements is away from blandness and everything, and actually into local and mine and stuff. And what Australian films, like every other local films, do at their best is they tell stories about us and me that relate to me. And exactly in the same way as you get a transformation in the hop industry in 2 years, I see no reason why, with a fair wind going, that the Australian films can or will not be exactly the same and respond to a kind of, if you like, a localism or neighbourhood demand, which I think is a kind of or part of the antidote to globalism. That's why I think this discussion is so important. Okay, thank you very much.